Dante Rinaldi had not cried once in the 4 months since his father's funeral, not at the wake, not at the burial, not in the private moments he'd carefully engineered to make sure no one in his organization ever saw a crack in him. He was crying now, alone in a penthouse suite at 2 a.m., when the door opened on a housekeeping card he'd forgotten to turn away, and a maid named Nadia Reyes walked in on the one unguarded moment of his entire adult life. Neither of them knew yet that it would be the most important mistake either of them ever made. To understand how a hotel maid ended up being the only person in Las Vegas who knew Dante Rinaldi was actually human, we have to go back 6 weeks to a cramped apartment on the east side of the city and a woman who had learned to move through the world without ever being seen. Nadia Reyes cleaned rooms on the Bellagio Grand's executive floor, 40 hours a week, plus whatever overtime she could pick up, and she had built an entire private discipline around being invisible to the guests she served, because invisibility, she'd learned early, was considerably safer than being noticed by men with more money than conscience. She was 29, and her life had a very specific architecture built around one central fact. Her younger brother, Matteo, 24, had been paralyzed from the waist down 3 years ago in a construction accident that the contractor's insurance had fought for 18 months before settling for an amount that covered exactly none of what a lifetime of specialized care actually required. Nadia had become, in the space of one hospital call, the person responsible for Matteo's rent, his physical therapy copays, the specific modifications their apartment needed that the landlord refused to make without a deposit Nadia didn't have. Her mornings began at 5 a.m., helping Matteo transfer from bed to chair before she left for a shift that started at 7. A routine so practiced it had become its own quiet choreography between them. Her evenings often ended with her sitting on the edge of his bed, both of them doing the specific exhausted math of 2 people trying to make an insufficient amount of money cover an unforgiving amount of need. "You don't have to stay every night," Matteo told her once, the particular guilt of a young man who hated being the reason his sister's life had shrunk to fit around his. "I can manage some things myself now." "I know you can," Nadia said. "I stay because I want to, not because I have to. Don't take that away from me too." Her co-worker Deja, who'd worked housekeeping at the Bellagio for 11 years, was the only person who fully understood the particular exhaustion Nadia carried without ever complaining about it out loud. "You disappear real good," Deja told her once, watching Nadia move through a hallway of wealthy guests without a single one of them registering her presence. "That's a skill, baby. Most people can't do that. Guests looking right through you like your furniture, and you just keep moving. It's easier than being seen," Nadia said. "Being seen usually means someone wants something from you or thinks you owe them something for existing near their money." She had learned that lesson specifically 2 years earlier, cleaning a suite for a wealthy guest who had complained to management that Nadia lingered too long simply for entering to restock towels, a complaint that nearly cost her the job and taught her, permanently, the exact careful choreography required to exist in these hallways without registering as a person at all. The Rinaldi family had run Las Vegas's most quietly influential casino operation for 2 generations, a network of properties along and just off the Strip that the business press described as hospitality and gaming, and everyone in the city's less legitimate circles understood by its older, more accurate name. Dante's grandfather had built it out of the desert with considerably fewer legal permits than the current operation maintained. His father, Salvatore, had spent 30 years consolidating and legitimizing it just enough to survive federal scrutiny, and Dante, 32, had inherited an empire 4 months ago under circumstances he had spent every single day since refusing to examine too closely because examining them meant confronting a grief he had no acceptable outlet for. Salvatore Rinaldi had died of what the official report called a sudden cardiac event, alone in his study. 4 months before this story begins, Dante had been the one to find him. Dante had also been the one who noticed, in the weeks following, small inconsistencies in his father's final days that his careful, controlled mind kept returning to at 2 a.m. when sleep refused to come, a canceled security detail on the one night it mattered most, a missing hour of camera footage nobody in the organization could adequately explain, the specific, uncomfortable fact that his uncle Enzo, his father's own brother, had been the last person to see Salvatore alive and had described that final conversation in a way that changed, subtly, each time Dante asked him to repeat it. Dante's power moved through Las Vegas the way desert heat moves through August, constant, oppressive, unmistakable to everyone who'd ever felt it directly. His organization ran 3 major properties along the Strip and controlled distribution networks that stretched into supply chains most tourists never thought to question. He had spent 4 months since his father's death, making absolutely certain no rival, no federal task force, and no ambitious relative ever saw a single genuine crack in his composure. Because in this business, grief read as weakness, and weakness read as opportunity. There was exactly one crack, and it lived in the specific, exhausting effort of a son who had never once been permitted, by his father's own hard rules or his own inherited pride, to grieve in front of anyone who worked for him. His rule, absolute and self-enforced, was simple. No one sees this, not his lieutenants, not his mother, certainly not a hotel maid who walked her cart through his floor twice a week and was paid, specifically, to see nothing at all. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, at 2 in the morning, the kind of hour when the Bellagio's executive floor went quiet enough that Nadia could work efficiently without the specific tension of navigating around guests. She had been told the penthouse suite was unoccupied for restocking, a scheduling error that would later be traced back to a miscommunication between 2 departments that had nothing to do with either Nadia or Dante and everything to do with the specific chaos of running a property this large. She pushed her cart through the door she believed was empty and found Dante Rinaldi sitting on the floor of his own suite, back against the sofa, a framed photograph of his father in his hands, his composed, controlled face completely undone, tears running freely down cheeks that had not, in 4 months, allowed themselves this in front of a single living person. Nadia froze in the doorway, every instinct she'd spent years perfecting screaming at her to back out immediately, apologize, disappear the way she always disappeared. But something in the specific rawness of the man in front of her, the particular quality of grief that had clearly been held so tightly for so long that it had finally broken through despite every defense he'd built, stopped her from simply retreating. Dante's head snapped up. For one terrible frozen second, neither of them moved. His face cycled through something Nadia recognized immediately, because she'd worn it herself more times than she could count, the specific horror of being seen in the exact moment you'd give anything not to be. "Get out," he said, his voice wrecked, stripped of every ounce of the composed authority Nadia imagined he usually carried. It wasn't a threat. It was closer to a plea. Nadia had a choice in that moment, the same choice she'd made 100 times before, in 100 rooms belonging to 100 wealthy strangers: apologize, disappear, pretend she'd seen nothing, protect herself the only way she knew how. Instead, something in his face, the specific, exhausted loneliness of a man who had clearly not let himself feel this in front of anyone, made her do something she had never once done in 6 years of careful invisibility. She stayed. "I'm not going to tell anyone," she said quietly, setting down the stack of towels she was still holding. "I clean this floor. I've seen worse things than a man grieving his father. You don't have to perform anything for me." Dante stared at her, and Nadia watched him make the specific rapid calculation of a man used to controlling every variable in every room, realizing there was nothing left to control in this one. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I know whose name is on the deed," Nadia said. "I don't know you. I don't need to. I just know that whatever you're carrying looks heavy enough that maybe you shouldn't carry it entirely alone tonight." If Nadia had simply backed out of that room and forgotten what she'd seen, this would be a very short story about an awkward mistake in room scheduling. Instead, what happened over the following weeks forced Dante to confront a grief he'd been running from for months, and forced Nadia to decide whether being seen by someone this powerful was a risk worth taking. Stay with this one, because the next part changes both their lives in ways neither of them saw coming. And if this story's got you hooked, now's a great time to hit that subscribe button. Dante found her 2 days later, waiting near the housekeeping station on her floor, an unprecedented gesture for a man who did not typically seek out staff in any personal capacity. "I need to understand why you didn't report what you saw," he said, "or ask for something in exchange for your silence." Everyone in my life wants something. I don't know how to process someone who didn't. I'm not everyone in your life, Nadia said. I'm a maid you happen to see cry in front of. That's not leverage, that's just a bad night. It wasn't just a bad night, Dante said, and something in his voice, the specific, exhausted honesty of a man who'd spent 4 months performing strength, made him continue before he'd fully decided to. My father died 4 months ago. I haven't let myself grieve him properly once. Not in front of anyone who works for me, not in front of my own mother. I didn't expect the one time it broke through would be witnessed by a stranger with a housekeeping cart. Grief doesn't wait for permission, Nadia said. I learned that when my brother's accident happened, you don't get to schedule when it breaks through. You just get to decide what you do after it does. Dante's first instinct, the one that had protected his organization through 4 months of careful performance, was to offer her money for her discretion, the specific transactional language his world ran on. He caught himself before he said it, some new instinct telling him it would land exactly wrong with this particular woman. Would you have an employer? Not as leverage. I don't actually know how to say thank you to someone who saw me at my worst and didn't try to use it. Nadia's instinct, honed by years of careful invisibility, was caution. But something in the specific vulnerability of the question, a powerful man admitting he didn't know how to say thank you properly, made her pause longer than she expected to. The bond built slowly, through small, honest conversations rather than anything resembling romance at first. Dante learned, over several careful weeks, about Matteo, about the specific, exhausting architecture of Nadia's life, and instead of reaching for his checkbook, the way his instincts told him to, he asked questions, showed up in small, practical ways, personally ensuring Matteo's physical therapist, who Dante happened to know through a hospital board he sat on, moved Matteo up a long waiting list for a specialized treatment program, not through money changing hands visibly, but through a phone call that cost him nothing, except the effort of actually caring enough to make it. You don't flinch when I talk about my father, Dante said one evening, sitting with her in the hotel's quiet staff break room after her shift, an arrangement that had become, without either of them quite naming it, a regular occurrence. Everyone else in my life either avoids the subject entirely or performs sympathy that feels like a transaction. I flinch at plenty, Nadia said. Just not at grief. I've had a lot of practice sitting with people's hardest moments without needing to fix them or perform around them. In return, one evening, Dante told her, quietly, about the specific inconsistencies that had been keeping him awake since his father's death, the canceled security detail, the missing camera footage, his uncle Enzo's story that shifted slightly every time Dante asked him to repeat it. He had told no one else this, not his own mother, not his most trusted lieutenants, because voicing the suspicion out loud made it real in a way he wasn't ready to confront. I think someone in my own family had something to do with my father's death, Dante admitted, the words visibly costing him something enormous to say aloud for the first time. And I don't know what to do with that, because acting on it without proof destroys this family from the inside, and not acting on it means living beside whoever did this every single day. You don't have to decide what to do with it tonight, Nadia said. You just needed to say it to someone who wasn't going to use it against you. Enzo Rinaldi had been Salvatore's younger brother and closest advisor for 30 years, present at every major decision the family had made since Dante was a child, trusted with a completeness that had never once been formally questioned, right up until the exact moment it should have been. Enzo's motive was old and patient, the specific bitterness of a man who had spent 3 decades watching his older brother inherit their father's full empire while Enzo received a respected but permanently secondary role, deputy rather than principal, forever the trusted advisor and never the man whose name was on the deed. That resentment had calcified over 30 years into a very specific, very patient plan: eliminate Salvatore in a way that would never trace back cleanly, position himself as the experienced, steady hand the organization needed during a difficult transition, and wait, patiently, for the moment his nephew Dante, young and grieving and inexperienced by comparison, made a mistake significant enough to justify Enzo stepping in permanently. Dante was, in Enzo's careful calculation, the last obstacle standing between 30 years of patient waiting and full control of an empire Enzo had quietly believed for decades should have been his in the first place. Nadia noticed the warning signs before Dante fully let himself see them. the particular things a woman trained by necessity to read rooms carefully catches, that a grieving son, distracted by loss, initially dismisses as ordinary family dynamics. Enzo's specific, careful positioning at every business meeting Dante attended, always slightly too close to the center of decisions that should have belonged entirely to Dante. The way Enzo's account of Salvatore's final evening shifted, subtly, each time Dante asked him to repeat a detail, small inconsistencies, Nadia noticed precisely because she was listening from outside the family's blind spots of loyalty and grief. "Your uncle changes small details every time he tells that story," Nadia said carefully. The first time she raised it directly with Dante. "I've noticed it twice now. That's not memory being imperfect. That's someone managing a story." Dante didn't dismiss her outright. The specific paralysis of a grieving son, whose entire framework for understanding his family collided with a stranger's careful observation. It would take one more direct confrontation before he was ready to act on what some part of him had already suspected for months. The escalation came fast. Once Enzo understood that Dante's new unusual attentiveness, his careful re-examination of his father's final days, had introduced a genuine threat to 30 years of patient planning. Enzo's people identified Nadia within days as the specific new variable in Dante's life, a hotel maid with unusual access to his private moments and, apparently, unusual influence over his renewed scrutiny of his father's death. Enzo did not move against Nadia directly at first. Instead, Matteo's physical therapy program, the one Dante had personally arranged, suddenly hit an inexplicable bureaucratic snag, a specific message calibrated with uncomfortable precision to remind Nadia exactly how easily the fragile stability she'd built for her brother could be undone by someone with the right connections. Nadia understood immediately what the message meant and brought it straight to Dante, her composure cracking for the first time since he'd known her. "Someone froze Matteo's treatment authorization. The timing isn't a coincidence, Dante. Someone wants me removed from your life specifically." Dante's face went very still, the specific stillness of a man doing rapid, cold arithmetic. "Enzo, I don't have proof," Nadia said. "I have a pattern." That night, Dante did what he should have done months earlier, quietly commissioning a full forensic review of his father's final week, cross-referencing security logs, financial records, and communications that had never been properly scrutinized during 4 months of grief-clouded assumption. What his investigators found, over the following 5 days, confirmed everything Nadia's careful observation had already suggested. Enzo had personally canceled Salvatore's security detail the night of his death, citing a scheduling adjustment that existed nowhere in the actual staffing records, and the missing hour of camera footage had been deleted using access credentials that belonged, unmistakably, to Enzo alone. The final piece fell into place when Dante's forensic accountant, cross-referencing Enzo's personal accounts, discovered Las Vegas's tightly controlled market, a payment structured precisely like the kind of reward paid for removing an obstacle rather than any legitimate business transaction. The confrontation happened in Salvatore's old study, the room Dante had avoided entering alone for 4 months. Enzo summoned for what he believed was a routine discussion about quarterly operations. Walking into a room where Dante sat waiting with the forensic evidence laid out plainly on his father's own desk, Nadia standing quietly by the door, present at Dante's specific, deliberate invitation. 30 years, Dante said, his voice level in a way that made it considerably more unsettling than shouting would have been. "You were the one person I trusted completely to help me understand what happened to my father, and you were the one who orchestrated it." Enzo's composure, built over 3 decades of careful, trusted advisor poise, cracked slowly rather than all at once. "Your father was going to expand into markets that would have exposed this entire family to federal scrutiny we couldn't survive, Dante. I protected this business. You protected your own 30 years of resentment," Dante said. He slid the forensic report across the desk, canceled security detail, deleted footage using your own credentials, a payment from Reno the week after his death that lines up exactly with a rival operation getting the access they'd been chasing for a decade. He looked at his uncle steadily. "You didn't protect this family. You sold it, and you were patient enough to wait for me to grieve quietly enough not to notice." Nadia watched Enzo's face cycle through the specific stages of a man realizing every exit had closed. Calculation, denial, and finally, the flat resignation of someone who understood the game had ended considerably more decisively than he'd planned for. She's the reason you're even looking at this, Enzo said finally, glancing at Nadia with something between contempt and grudging recognition. A hotel maid undid 30 years of careful planning. She's the reason I finally let myself grieve my father properly, Dante said, which apparently was the one thing standing between you and getting away with this entirely. He looked. Everyone believe you simply retired. Or this evidence goes to the federal task force that's been circling our organization for years, and you can explain to them exactly how you murdered your own brother. Enzo left Las Vegas within the week, the specific quiet exile of a man who understood he'd been given considerably more mercy than he'd shown his own brother. 3 months later, the Rinaldi organization operated under Dante's full, uncontested authority for the first time since his father's death. The specific quiet confidence of a man who had finally been allowed to properly grieve rather than perform strength through unprocessed loss. Nadia no longer cleaned rooms on the executive floor. Mateo's treatment program, fully restored and expanded, had stabilized enough that Nadia had accepted, cautiously, a position managing guest relations for the property. Properly paid, properly respected, no longer invisible furniture, in hallways full of wealthy strangers who never looked twice. The board asked me today, Dante said, finding Nadia on the hotel's rooftop terrace on an ordinary evening, the Vegas skyline glittering below them, why I promoted a former housekeeper to a position that usually requires years of hospitality management experience. He looked out at the lights. I told them they were asking the wrong question. It was never about her resume. It was about who actually stayed in the room when everyone else would have run. Nadia didn't look away from the skyline. You're getting better at this, letting people actually see you, instead of just the version you think you're supposed to be. I had a very patient teacher, Dante said, and for the first time since she'd known him, saying it cost him nothing at all. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional cinematic stories like this one. Do you think Nadia should have stayed silent that night instead of getting involved in someone else's grief? Or was reaching out the right call? Tell us in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.